Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association. Missouri produces wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details on the variety of products made in the state are at choosewood.com.
We hope you enjoy listening to this podcast of St. Louis on the Air, brought to you by University College at Washington University, with undergraduate and graduate programs part-time, evening, and online. University College at Washington University, offering world-class education within reach.
Now to a subject close to the hearts of many music aficionados, jazz. St. Louis has played a big role in the history and evolution of jazz. That will certainly be acknowledged by our guest, Kevin Whitehead. He can be heard on this station as the jazz critic for NPR's Fresh Air. He's in town for an event which we'll talk about, and he is the author of Why Jazz and the soon-to-be-published Play the Way You Feel. Kevin, thanks for being with us.
Thank you for having me. It's great to be here.
Well, you're in the right town for jazz. I mean, after New Orleans, I guess we're right up there, aren't we?
You're the first stop from people leaving New Orleans, and of course, a lot of people coming from St. Louis itself.
How do you differentiate jazz from other music? How and why is it different?
Improvisation is central to it, of course, and that's not unique to jazz, but it's certainly one of its defining characteristics. And the various African-American aspects of it, of the tradition going back to West African drum choirs, sort of evolving into like jazz rhythm sections, things like that.
Is that the most important influence, the African-American influence?
It's hard to separate out all the influences in jazz, but I would say that the African-American strain is the most crucial. Even if someone from Indonesia is playing jazz, they're going to be reflecting African-American aesthetics one way or another.
Well, are they playing jazz in Indonesia? Are they playing jazz in other parts of the world as much as we do?
They have been, I don't know about as much as we do, but people have been playing jazz around the world pretty much as soon as they heard about it. Mm-hmm. You know, by the mid-20s, you had jazz musicians in Indonesia, and a jazz practicum course was being taught at the conservatory in Frankfurt, and you had American musicians living in France and England, Canada.
Not everybody is a fan of jazz. A lot of people just kind of shrug their shoulders. They don't get it. What would you tell them? What would you tell them to listen for and teach them how to appreciate that genre?
I guess I tell them to read the book that I wrote that was sort of specifically addressing this subject, which is called Why Jazz from Oxford University Press, which, by the way, I'm going to be talking about at Dr. Gerald Early's book club tonight at 7 o'clock. At the Stewart Center for Jazz.
Over at Washington University? Where?
At the Stewart Center for Jazz, right around the corner.
I was thinking of Early being at Washington University, yeah. Well, tell me a little bit about that book and how you approached it and why you felt the need to explain it to people.
I was asked by the press, Oxford University Press. You can't talk so well today.
Neither can I. I don't know what it
is.
It's the cold weather, I guess.
I think it froze my tongue a little bit. An introduction to the music for people who didn't know about it that would also have information that would be of interest to people who did have some background in jazz. So part of it was trying to answer those basic questions like why do we listen to jazz at all, or why do reissues have like 3 different versions of the same song on it, that kind of thing. And also looking at, in particular, jazz since 1980, trying to sort of present a kind of organized view of what's going on in that period, because I saw a lot of jazz histories, they would get very vague once you got past the 1970s.
Oh, really? I wonder why that would be. I mean, with our ability to communicate these days, you would think just the opposite.
I think it was the fact that there were so many different strains of jazz that were coming along at that time that writers would sort of divide them up into different streams, and I wanted to really look at things sort of decade by decade and see the things that, say, Wynton Marsalis's conservative jazz and Muhal Richard Abrams' more radical jazz had in common.
Well, there you go. I mean, this is one of the things that I think people who maybe are not really into it don't know about. You talk about radical jazz. What is radical jazz?
Radical jazz, I guess, is the kind that people like to complain about. Free jazz, the avant-garde of the 1960s, there was a revolution in jazz at that time, people coming up with new modes of expression that were sometimes more dissonant and more high energy than some earlier forms of jazz. And so a lot of people found that kind of harder to take. But now it's 50 years later, so I think we can probably get our heads around the kinds of things that musicians were starting to do at that time.
Who were some of those in the 60s that were so prominent and really influential?
I'd say the main ones would be Ornette Coleman, John Coltrane, Albert Ayler, and Cecil Taylor would probably be the top four, all of whom were developing the music in slightly different ways from each other.
Well, it certainly has changed over the years. Let's go back. Let's go back to the early days. And when would that be? I mean, are we going back to the 30s? Are we going back beyond that? I mean, we have ragtime prior to
There is people. They always talk about the beginning of jazz as if suddenly one day there was no jazz and the next day there was. But jazz is like anything else. It kind of evolved out of things that were around beforehand. So definitely ragtime was the main influence on jazz. In fact, early jazz, the practitioners of it usually referred to it as ragtime up until the late teens. Yeah. So it probably starts sometime around 1900, probably in New Orleans, and first turns up on record around 1916, 1917, depending on which records you think are the first.
Why New Orleans? Why was it the hotbed and the origin of all of this?
A couple of reasons. One important aspect of jazz is a rhythmic strain that's influenced a lot by Cuban rhythms, and there was much more commerce between Havana and New Orleans than any other ports in the United States. Also, you had the educated class of Creole musicians, mixed-race Creole musicians in New Orleans who had a fine instrumental technique, who blended with country musicians who were used to playing in kind of rowdy brass bands out in rural areas. And when they came together, there was sort of this slow and gradual kind of coming together of their two aesthetics.
Mm-hmm. Let's move to the 20s and the 30s and talk about jazz as perhaps closer to what we know today in many ways. Who were the practitioners then that we would know about and should know about?
Well, Louis Armstrong, of course, the first great jazz soloist. I mean, I think jazz was more of a collective art beforehand. If you think of, say, Dixieland music or New Orleans-style music where everybody is sort of playing at the same time. And then someone like Armstrong, he really had the need to be able to improvise in a less interrupted way. So musicians began to carve out space for a soloist in these recordings. In particular, Armstrong's Hot Fives were really very important as far as that goes in the mid-20s.
Do we put Duke Ellington into the mix?
We certainly do. Ellington went into the Cotton Club about, 1927, I think, 1928? He'd already been working in New York for a few years. He originally came from Washington, D.C. I shy away from superlatives when I talk about jazz, but Ellington was the greatest. He was the most comprehensive composer, wrote fabulously lyrical music that might have a kind of simplicity in the melodic line that might just have based on a pentatonic scale like you would find in folk musics, and a fantastic sense of the timbre of instruments, partly based on close observation of what his musicians were doing. He cultivated eccentric soloists and liked to write pieces of music that would sort of cater to their eccentricities.
And of course,
wah-wah brass playing.
Yeah, well, he was a band leader. I mean, it was a large ensemble that he was directing with his music at the time, as opposed to a soloist, a Louis Armstrong, for instance.
Yeah, but there were some great soloists in the Ellington band in the 20s.
You mentioned that he was more melodic, and that's what I see. I can hum Duke Ellington songs, and I can whistle his songs, but I can't do it to a lot of the people today.
It's harder. Yes, I agree with you on that.
Yeah. You brought some music along with you that we'd like to hear, that perhaps you can instruct us to how some of this is different from what people of my vintage might be more familiar with. Well, which would you like to listen to first? And
why don't we listen to Christian Scott, Atunde Adjua, and his piece,
The Reckoning.
The Reckoning.
Let's listen to that, and you can tell us what we're listening to. Well, I would have to think that this is a very recent vintage.
Yes, it's from an EP that came out last year called Ruler Rebel.
What sets it apart?
First of all, I should mention Christian Scott Atunde Adjoa is a trumpet player from New Orleans, so he has that connection back to the early days. And what fascinates me about this music is how he's using modern kind of post-hip-hop production techniques, using drum machines and things like that, but still manages to get this kind of iconic New Orleans brass sound in it. And this idea of music being made in a resonant space. New Orleans is a place where people make a lot of the physical environment. You used to hear these stories about how Buddy Bolden, the first great jazz cornet player of the early years of the century, could be heard playing miles away, or so the story goes. And as brass bands would say, move through a neighborhood, you'd have this thing happening where sometimes you could hear the sound very clearly, and sometimes it would be obscured by houses in the way, so the sound would kind of come in and out. And there's a sense of that same kind of sound moving in and out in this piece of music. What I like about it is I'm always on about the idea that jazz reinvents itself out of its root materials, and I think this is a good example of how someone does something it's really contemporary, but also acknowledges the kind of distant early days of the music.
You mentioned hip-hop a moment ago. Is there an influence, a jazz influence on hip-hop or vice versa?
I would say both. Certainly in early hip-hop, a lot of the samples that were used behind rappers were drawn from vintage jazz records, particularly of hard bop records of the 50s and 60s. But then a few years after that, we began to see generations of musicians coming along who had always had hip-hop in their lives, the way a previous generation had grown up on rock music, let's say. And so that seeps into their sense of rhythm and their sense of what's acceptable and what can be manipulated in a jazz-like way.
Yeah, see, I see hip-hop. I'm not an aficionado by any stretch of the imagination, but I see it as just a beat. I don't hear much music there, per se.
Well, this isn't the place to debate that, I would say, but certainly the beat is a good starting point. Yeah. There was a time when, particularly hip-hop beats, you would hear jazz drummers kind of quote them in a self-conscious way. And then sometime maybe about 15 years ago or so, it sounded like they really kind of incorporated those hip-hop beats into a much more free-flowing kind of jazz aesthetic. Yeah. So I think it's just a question of what musicians grow up with, what seems like music of their own time.
Okay, well, let's not debate that now. But I have some other thoughts on it, but I better not get into them. Let's have some more music, though. What is your next choice here, and how is it going to be different from what we just heard?
Let's listen to the clarinet player Andy Biskin.
Alrighty.
He has a piece called, I can't read my own handwriting anymore.
Muskrat.
Muskrat, thank you, which is a children's song from the Kentucky coal country, I believe.
And this has vocal with it?
No, it's an instrumental version. Andy Biskin, the clarinet player, was an assistant in the 1970s to the folklorist Alan Lomax. So his recent album was taking songs that Alan Lomax had collected and presenting kind of modern versions of it for an unusual ensemble. The lineup of this band is clarinet, drums, and 3 trumpets. I can't think of another band that has quite that instrumentation.
Yeah, well, let's give it a listen. Back with Kevin Whitehead after listening to a little Muskrat. That seems very, very playful to me.
I would certainly agree. I mean, it's in keeping with the fact that it's a children's song as the beginning of the material. And it's a good example of how, for a lot of jazz musicians, the simpler the initial material, the more elaborately you can play variations on it. And in the course of this piece, which goes on for a few minutes longer, you can hear all sorts of influences coming out, kind of Aaron Copland, Western movie scores, the kind of folk jazz that was sort of popular in the late 50s, presented by people like the clarinet player Jimmy Giuffre, and sort of loose congregational church singing where the lead voice would lay out a line, and then this kind of loose unison response would come from the members of the congregation.
Right. You talk about improvisation, and obviously that's a big part of the jazz picture, but are any of these notes written down beforehand and then they kind of go from there?
Yeah, I think in this particular case, most of the music was sketched out in advance. There are some tricky key changes in there and things which are clearly not spontaneous. Yeah. But there's always something, there's always some improvised content there, even if it's just in different ways of playing variations on written material.
Yeah. Well, let's, as time begins to get away, let's go to our third now. This is a vocal, and vocal, obviously, performance is a big part of jazz and has been since day one, I assume. Am I correct on that?
You are.
All righty. Well, this is Cecile McLaurin-Savant. Is that the correct pronunciation
I
of her
believe
name?
it is, yeah.
Okay.
From her brand new album, The Window.
The Window. Let's give a listen to her.
People hand in hand, have I lived to see the milk and honey land, where hate's a dream and love forever stands? Or is this a vision in my mind? The law was never passed, but somehow...
Kevin, that's a lot easier for me to listen to than some of the radical things that we were talking about earlier. This is how I see jazz. I mean, that's just my particular personal taste.
We didn't mention what the song is that she's singing here, but it's a Stevie Wonder tune from 1973, Visions. I think Cecile McLaurin-Savant is a fantastic singer. That's one reason I wanted to listen to her today. And it's a reminder that jazz continues to generate great singers like herself, and also a reminder that musicians are so influenced by the kind of thing that they grew up with. This Stevie Wonder's music would have been something that was in her ears all along, and kind of shows how the jazz repertoire has kind of changed a lot since the time when most musicians were playing songs from like Broadway or the movies, that kind of traditional American pop song.
Why is this called jazz, though? It's so different from Coltrane and so different from some of the other performances that we've even heard here today.
Because it still has that kind of creative improvisational aesthetic behind it. She and the piano player Sullivan Fortner, they have a really nice rapport. And I really like the intimacy of this sound also.
Yeah. But certainly they sat down and went over this before she started
Oh,
singing.
yeah. Clearly they're very well rehearsed. She's super conscientious about these things.
Well, I guess with jazz, as with most things, and certainly music, you take out of it, what you will. And it's not for everybody, but it's not all the same either. There's plenty of variety.
Yeah, and it's not like everybody has to like everything, Although I'll say, with the reviews that I do on Fresh Air, I try to give a sense of the breadth of modern jazz, which involves some of that more difficult music from time to time.
Do you like everything?
I like pretty much everything I review on the radio. Do I like everything? No. I don't think anybody likes everything, but I also recognize that we all have deaf spots, let's call them. People who are great, but maybe we aren't personally so fond of what they do.
You're in town for an event tomorrow night. We should talk about that a little bit because you're talking about a yet-to-be-published book correct? That is dealing with jazz and films, that history. That sounds really fascinating to me.
Yeah, I'm glad you think so. The book is called Play the Way You Feel, and it's due out from Oxford sometime next year. And it's a look from a jazz perspective at movies that take jazz as subject matter. And also a few films in which there are scenes in which jazz intrudes on the narrative for a few minutes.
Intrudes on the narrative. Just takes over?
Like there was a movie a couple of years ago called Genius about the relationship between the editor Maxwell Perkins and the writer Thomas Wolfe. Mm-hmm. And at one point, Thomas Wolfe feels that Perkins is cutting too much of his prose, so he decides to take Perkins up to Harlem to hear the jazz music that inspires his prose. And it's sort of unique in jazz films in that you see a lot of people who love jazz in the movies, and you see a lot of people who hate it. But Maxwell Perkins is the perfectly jazz-indifferent person. He listens to the music and then excuses himself and goes home and goes right back to slashing away at Thomas Wolfe's prose as if hearing jazz hadn't changed a thing for him.
What are some of the early movies in which this sort of thing was featured? Jazz was a character, if you will.
Well, of course, the first talking picture, the first talking feature film, The Jazz Singer with Al Jolson. Everybody always says Al Jolson wasn't really a jazz singer, and that's true. But he was a jazz whistler. He does a fantastic whistling solo on Toot Toot Tootsie in that film, which is quite remarkable. And there were a few other early ones. There was from 1929. There's a Rudy Valley film, and the name of which I am completely blanking on at this time. The Vagabond something. How embarrassing! Where he's a mail-order saxophonist who ups his game to the point where he can go on the radio and impersonate a name band leader. There's also a 1929 film called Street Girl, in which a violinist from Eastern Europe becomes embroiled with a jazz band in New York.
Are these still available? Can I find them on Netflix?
You can find some of them on YouTube and some of them on Netflix, I think. Most of them are around somewhere or other.
I think I've got a lot of studying to do to catch up on my jazz knowledge, but I appreciate, Kevin Whitehead, your being here. I should point out that you're going to be appearing tomorrow night at 7 o'clock at the Jazz St. Louis Whitaker Jazz Speaks Play the Way You Feel event. That's the Grants View branch of the St. Louis County Library. You'll have a good crowd there, I'm sure.
I'm hoping so.
Great to have you with us.
We're going to show some clips. It'll be nice, I think.
Oh, you've got some film clips. Some of these old films. Oh, great. That's going to be great. 7 o'clock tomorrow night. Kevin Whitehead, thank you.
You are welcome.
Great to see you.
Support comes from the Missouri Forest Products Association. Missouri produces wood pallets, railroad ties, white oak barrels, hardwood floors, and more. Details on the variety of products made in the state are at choosewood.com.